Okay, so you want to own a pirate ship, black sail, a skull flag snapping in the wind, gold spilling out of a chest on some warm beach, split by firelight, among men who answer to no king. That's the image. Here's a real number that ends it fast. In 1696, London investors put up roughly £6,000. They funded a pirate captain's ship. That captain was William Kidd. 5 years later, he was hanged at Execution Dock. His body was left swinging as a warning. His backers walked away untouched. Their names barely appeared in the scandal. This video is not about treasure chests. It's not about buried maps, or parrots, or one-eyed captains shouting orders. It's about who actually got paid, who bore the risk, and who got left holding the rope while the money quietly moved somewhere else entirely. Here's the myth people carry into this topic. They think a pirate ship sold violence, and the product was gold. That's backwards. A pirate ship was a floating logistics operation. Nothing more romantic than that. The actual product wasn't the raid itself. It was stolen cargo, laundered back into legal markets through a black market network on land. The ship didn't make money by looting a vessel. It made money by moving that cargo to someone willing to buy it quietly. At a discount, no questions asked. Strip away the flag and the cutlass. What's left is an uninsured shipping company running an illegal supply chain with a body count. Every prize was inventory. Every fence was a wholesale buyer. Every captain was really an unlicensed logistics manager with a sword instead of a spreadsheet. Every crewman was, in effect, an uninsured contractor, paid entirely on commission. You weren't running a raid, you were running distribution. Let's build one from scratch. We'll use Kidd's actual venture as the backbone. It's one of the best documented pirate financings that survives, preserved in colonial office papers, and in the transcript of his 1701 trial. Kidd's ship, the Adventure Galley, was built in 1695, a 34-gun vessel designed for speed. It carried oars for when the wind died. His financiers were not romantics. They were calculating, powerful men. Among them sat Lord Bellamy, soon to govern New York, and the merchant Robert Livingston, who brokered the deal. Quietly tucked into the paperwork, King William III held a stake, roughly 10% hidden from public view. Total capital raised, about £6,000. That figure survives in the venture's backing agreement. It covered construction, cannon, and powder. Months of salted provisions, too. And a legal document called a letter of marque. That paper was the entire difference between piracy and patriotism, provided you attacked the right flag and shared the proceeds with the right king. But legal cover on paper wasn't the whole expense. Colonial governors regularly took payments to look the other way. Governor Benjamin Fletcher of New York was later investigated for exactly this, accepting money and gifts from known pirate captains in exchange for safe harbor. That's not romantic swashbuckling. That's a recurring line item. Call it a licensing fee for a market that officially didn't exist. Gunpowder itself wasn't cheap either. A single barrel could run several pounds. Multiply that across months of engagements and it adds up fast. Cannon required constant maintenance and skilled gunners to operate safely. A crew also needed a carpenter, on permanent retainer. Wooden hulls split, leaked, and rotted constantly at sea. Here's the surprise line item nobody budgets for: the surgeon's chest. 18th century ships lost more men to infection than to cannon fire. A stocked medical chest was core capital, not an afterthought bolted on later. Surgeons commanded extra shares of any prize, because qualified ones were scarce, and combat injuries were constant. A crew without one simply bled out slowly. Provisioning alone could eat a third of a venture's capital. 80 men at sea, for 6 months, ate enormous amounts of salt beef, ship's biscuit, and rum. Now convert that £6,000 into something real. A skilled English laborer, around 1700, earned roughly 1 shilling 6pence a day. When work was steady, which it often wasn't, £6,000 works out to about 80,000 laborer days. That's one man's entire working career, repeated across 4 full lifetimes, just to float one armed ship, and that's before a single cannon had fired, or a single sail had caught wind. Now the part almost nobody names correctly. Who actually owned what, and who bore the risk? The investors owned the capital and the legal cover. Under the venture's terms, they took the largest cut of any prize. Kidd held a comparatively small personal stake, despite carrying nearly all the operational risk. If the voyage went bad, Kidd faced a courtroom, and eventually, a scaffold. His backers faced, at worst, an uncomfortable dinner conversation. Then there was the crew's own internal government, running in parallel to that investor contract, largely invisible to the men funding it from London. Pirate crews typically operated under written articles, sometimes called a chasse-partie, dividing anticipated plunder into shares before a voyage even sailed. The captain conventionally drew 1.5 to 2 shares. Ordinary sailors drew a single share each. Crucially, the crew elected a quartermaster, a role with no true equivalent on any naval ship. The quartermaster controlled the physical distribution of captured loot. He adjudicated disputes between crewmen. He could override the captain on nearly anything, except direct combat command during an engagement. That's the structural clause almost nobody names correctly. 2 ownership structures, stacked on top of one another, Land money sat on top. Crew democracy operated underneath. The captain was squeezed between both, legally exposed no matter which way the voyage turned. Bartholomew Roberts' surviving articles, preserved through Captain Charles Johnson's contemporary account, went further still. They guaranteed compensation for lost limb. A man who lost a leg in battle received extra shares, a form of built-in disability insurance centuries before the term existed. No merchant vessel of the period offered anything comparable. Compare that to the investors sitting safely in London. They risked capital, not limb. If a voyage failed, they absorbed a paper loss. If it succeeded, they collected the largest single share of the payout. The crew absorbed the physical risk and split what was left. That asymmetry is the real engine underneath this entire trade. It's the same asymmetry underneath most risky ventures, then and now. The people closest to the danger usually capture the smallest share of the upside. Call it the oldest structural pattern in finance. Someone else's capital, someone else's paperwork, and your own body on the line. So, where did the real sustained money come from? The obvious line is captured cargo, coin, and bullion. Yes, that mattered when it happened, but it was wildly unreliable. It wasn't where sustained wealth actually got built. The bigger, steadier engine was ransom. Rather than seizing a ship outright, crews often held it, or held its wealthier passengers for payment, then released the ship, largely intact. This was a documented common practice across the era, closer to a business transaction than a battle. Even more lucrative was the fencing network on land. Adam Baldridge ran a trading post on St. Mary's Island, off Madagascar, operating there from 1691 to 1697. He bought stolen goods directly from passing pirate crews, then resold provisions, weapons, and rum back to them at a steep, captive market markup. That post functioned as a genuine black market clearing for the entire Indian Ocean pirate trade. It's documented through colonial correspondence and later legal testimony against Baldridge himself. A comparable haven existed closer to home. Nassau, in the Bahamas, became a loosely governed pirate hub around 1713. Hundreds of pirates gathered there between raids, trading loot, drinking, and resupplying, largely beyond any crown's reach. Information itself became a tradable commodity in places like Nassau. Knowing which merchant convoys sailed when, and lightly armed, was worth real money. Captains paid informants in port for exactly that kind of intelligence. It let a crew skip weeks of fruitless searching and go straight to a target. Beyond the fence, there was straightforward protection extortion, effectively taxing merchant ships for safe passage. There was credit as well. Quartermasters often controlled onboard stores and sold provisions to their own crewmen against future shares. The cutlass got the headlines and the painting. The ransom letter, the fence, and the markup on rum did the earning. Now the failure. This trade destroyed nearly everyone who touched it, and it destroyed them in genuinely different ways. Take the legal and political collapse first. William Kidd's voyage produced disappointing results for over a year. Desperate for any prize at all, he attacked a merchant ship. It was flying false colors and turned out to be protected by powerful trading interests. His own backers, the men who'd funded him, distanced themselves instantly. The moment the affair became a public scandal, Kidd was arrested in Boston, shipped back to London in irons. He was tried and hanged in May 1701. His body was left on display at Tilbury Point. A deliberate warning, visible to every outbound sailor. His ship and remaining cargo were seized by the crown. The men who profited from his fitting out never faced trial. Not Bellamy, not Livingston, not the king who quietly held 10%. The scandal needed exactly one visible name to end quietly. Kidd was chosen for that role, whether he understood it or not. Now take combat destruction, a completely different failure mode. Bartholomew Roberts commanded one of history's most successful pirate fleets. He captured an estimated 400 vessels across only a few years. In February 1722, his flagship engaged HMS Swallow, off the coast of what is now Gabon, a Royal Navy warship, in open battle. Roberts was killed almost immediately by grapeshot, reportedly still wearing his finest crimson coat. His fleet was destroyed or captured within hours, its entire structure gone in a single afternoon. What followed was the largest pirate trial in recorded history, held at Cape Coast Castle, on the West African coast. 52 of his surviving crew were ultimately hanged. A vast multi-ship organization, wiped out in one engagement. Roberts had operated for roughly 3 years before that battle, long enough to become the most successful pirate captain on record. Not long enough to retire. The math on combat risk simply catches up eventually, no matter how skilled the captain. Then there's environmental catastrophe requiring no enemy at all. Samuel Bellamy's ship, the Whydah Galley, had been built as a slave ship. Bellamy's crew captured and refitted it for piracy in 1717. They loaded it with an enormous haul of plundered gold and silver. Weeks later, sailing off Cape Cod, the Whydah met a violent April storm. It struck a sandbar and broke apart in the surf. Nearly the entire crew of over 100 men drowned. within sight of the Massachusetts shore. The wreck sat lost for over 250 years, until archaeologist Barry Clifford located it and began excavating in 1984. His team eventually recovered tens of thousands of coins and artifacts, forming one of the only verified pirate ship inventories on Earth. That inventory is, in a strange way, the most honest ledger in this entire story. Coins frozen mid-transaction on the seafloor, never spent. No trial, no enemy fleet, no courtroom, just bad weather and simple physics. There's a fourth exit worth naming too, quieter than the other. In 1718, King George offered a formal royal pardon. Governor Woodes Rogers carried it to Nassau himself. Several hundred pirates accepted amnesty and simply quit. It wasn't romantic. It was a bureaucratic off-ramp, and many men took it. Compare that to Kidd's fate, or Roberts's fate. The men who survived this trade rarely survived it by fighting harder. They survived it by finding the exit and using it before the account came due. And finally, the rare exception, the one case study here who genuinely got out clean. Henry Every led the 1695 capture of the Ganj-e-Sawai, a heavily armed Mughal treasure ship. It remains one of the single richest hauls in piracy's history. Estimates drawn from East India Company records suggest a figure near £1,000 per ordinary sailor, an almost unthinkable sum for a common seaman. The attack triggered a genuine diplomatic crisis between England and the Mughal Empire, along with the first worldwide manhunt on record, backed by a royal bounty. Every simply vanished afterward. He was never captured, never tried, never definitively heard from again. Of every case study in this video, he alone arguably won. Historians estimate 1,000 to 2,000 pirates were active across the Caribbean and Atlantic. That was during the peak years, around 1716 to 1718, the so-called Golden Age. It's a small industry, not a movement. A commonly cited estimate puts the average pirate's active career at around 2 years. Before death, capture, or retirement ended it. 2 years. That's the honest shelf life of this business. Now, the ledger, built from these documented outcomes into 3 plausible annual scenarios for a mid-sized pirate crew of roughly 80 men. These are reconstructions drawn from the real cases above, not surviving account books. Treat the specific totals as informed estimates, not verified archival figures. In a good year, picture something close to Every's outcome. A single major prize nets the crew tens of thousands of pounds. There's the quartermaster's cut for maintenance and provisioning, taken off the top. Even after that, an ordinary sailor's share could still land near £1,000. That's a documented order of magnitude, drawn from the Ganj-e-Sawai case itself, roughly 13,000 laborer days of wages, earned from one single successful voyage. It's also worth remembering how rare that outcome actually was. Most crews, across most years, never saw a prize that size at all. Every's haul is the exception people remember precisely because it almost never happened. In an average year, the reality most crews actually lived, prizes were smaller merchant vessels, carrying modest cargo, ransom payments, or provisions rather than gold bullion. Costs still stacked up regardless of how small the prize was. Hull repairs, torn sails, restocking the surgeon's chest, paying the fence his cut at a post like Baldridge's. After all that, tally up what was left for an ordinary sailor, likely closer to 20 or 30 pounds for the entire year, comparable to a skilled tradesman's yearly wage back on land, minus the tradesman's much better odds of dying quietly decades later, in his own bed. In a bad year, there was no prize captured at all, or the ship itself was lost outright, as happened to Bellamy's crew. Remaining provisions had to be covered from earlier shares, if any survived. Injured or dead crewmen produced no ongoing income for their families. There was no continuing wage structure at sea, no sick pay, no pension for a widow back on land. Only a one-time share, and only if a share had actually been earned that voyage. A man who died on a losing voyage often died in debt, owing money to the ship's own stores. His family, if he had one, received nothing at all. Here's the figure almost never subtracted, but should be. Impute a fair wage for the captain's own unpaid labor. Factor in his near-constant legal exposure, and the very real chance of ending on a public gallows. The so-called profit in most pirate ledgers evaporates under scrutiny. Kidd himself effectively worked for roughly 5 years on this venture. He was ultimately paid in a length of rope. So, could you actually get rich doing this? A small handful of men genuinely did, almost always by cashing out early and disappearing quietly, the way Every seems to have managed against every historical odd, or by taking the pardon and walking away quietly like the men at Nassau. Most men did not manage anything close to that. Most died of shipboard disease, or drowned in a sudden storm, off some unfamiliar coast, or hanged in front of a paying crowd that gathered specifically to watch. You thought you were running a raiding party under a black flag, answering to nobody. What you were actually running was an unlicensed shipping company, financed by absentee landlords back in London, staffed entirely by uninsured labor, and audited, sooner or later, either by a courtroom or by the open sea. The flag was never the business. The flag was just the branding. The ledger, the one nobody wrote down honestly, was the actual business the whole time. Everything else, the flag, the rum, The legend was just the marketing wrapped around it.